Good morning, my dear students. Let's begin our history class. In continuation of my second video book, The Themes in World History, and Chapter 3, An Empire Across Three Continents. Today I am going to start with the topic Gender Role in Roman Empire. One of the more modern feature of Roman society was the widespread prevalence of the nuclear family. Means in Roman Empire people lived in nuclear family. Adult son did not live with their families, and it was exceptional for adult brother to share a common household. On the other hand, slave were included in the family. So this is the family composition. Along with this, another feature of the nuclear family, the typical form of marriage was one of where the wife did not transfer to her husband authority but retained full right in the property of her natal family, while the woman dowry went to the husband for the duration of the marriage. The woman remained a primary heir of her father and became an independent property owner of her father's death. Marriage were generally arranged, and there is no doubt that women were often subject to domination by their husbands, whereas male married in their late 20s or early 30s, women were married off in the late teens or early 20s. So there was an age gap between husband and wife, and would have encouraged a certain inequality. Divorce was relatively easy and need no more than a twice or a notice of intent to divorce the marriage by either husband or wife. On the other hand, Augustine, the great Catholic bishop, tells us that his mother was regularly beaten by the father, and that most other wives in the small town where he grew up had similar bruises to show. Finally, father had substantial legal control over the children, and sometimes to a shocking degree. For example, a legal power of life and death is exposing unwanted children by leaving them out in the cold die. So this is how the family composition work, and the father have authority over the family. He can take all the decision related to the children. Now we are going to see the literacy. Literacy in Roman Empire. It is certain that rates of casual literacy varied greatly between different parts of the empire. For example, these all points considered important for 1 mark. In Pomley, the place often carried advertisement and graffiti were found all over the city. Here, the Pomley, which was buried in a volcanic eruption in 79 CE, there is a strong evidence of widespread casual literacy. So, example of this casual literacy we can found on the walls of the main street of Pomley. Often carried advertisement and graffiti were found all over the city. Then another example by contrast in Egypt, where hundreds of papyri survive. Most formal documents such as contracts were usually written on professional scribe, and they often tell us that X and Y are unable to read and write. But there were certain group, those who can read and write, the certainly more widespread among certain category such as soldier, army officer and estate manager, along with the professional scribe, can read and write. Plurality of language that were spoken in Roman Empire, they were Aramaic, Coptic, Punic, Berber and Celtic, but many of these linguistic culture were purely oral, at least until a script was invented for them. Among the above mentioned language, Armenian began to be written as late 5th century, and it is the only to begin written as late 5th century. So Armenian is the one language which can be considered as the written language. The example of this thing you can see in the translation of Bible by the middle of the 3rd century. Then if we see one more example, elsewhere the spread of Latin displaced the written form of language that were otherwise widespread. This happened notable in Celtic, which ceased to be written after the 1st century. Now we are going to see the economic expansion in the Roman Empire. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbor, mine, quarries, brickyard, olive oil factories, etc. Now we are going to see the trading rights. Wheat, wine, olive oil were traded and consumed in huge quantities, and they came mainly from Spain, the Gallic province, North Africa, and Egypt, and to a lesser extent Italy, where conditions were best of these crops. Liquid like wine and olive oil were transported in container called amphora. The fragment and the shade of the very large number of these amphoras survived, and it has been possible for archaeologists to reconstruct the precise shape of these containers. The empire included many regions that had a reputation for exceptional fertility. Italy, Sicily, Egypt, and southern Spain were among the most densely settled or wealthiest part of the empire. The best kind of wine and olive oil came mainly from numerous estates of these territories. On the other hand, large Roman territories were in a much less advanced state. The pastoral and semi nomadic communities were often on the move, carrying their oven shaped huts with them. As Roman estates expanded in North Africa, the postures of those communities were drastically reduced and their movement more tightly regulated. Diversified applications of water power around the Mediterranean, as well as advance in water powered milling technology. The use of hydraulic mining technique in the Spanish gold and silver mines, and the gigantic industrial scale on which those mines were worked. The existence of well organized commercial and banking network and the widespread use of money are all indications of Roman economy. Controlling of slaves and workers. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean and Near East. And Christianity, when it emerged as the state religion, seriously challenged this institution under Augustus. There were still 3 million slaves in a total Italian population of 7.5 million. Slaves were an investment, and at least one Roman agriculture writer advised landowners against using them because their health could be damaged by malaria. On the other hand, if the Roman upper classes were often brutal towards their slaves, ordinary people did something show much more compassion. As warfare became less widespread with the establishment of peace in the 1st century, the supply of slaves tended to decline, and the users of slave labor thus had to turn either to slave breeding or a cheaper substitutes such as wage labor, which was more easily dispensable. In fact, free labor was extensively used on public work at Rome because an extensive use of slave labor would have been too expensive. Slaves had to be fed and maintained throughout the year, which increased the cost of holding this kind of labor. Management of labor by Columella. The Roman agriculture writer paid a great deal of attention to the management of labor. Columella, 1st century writer who came from the south of Spain, recommended that the landowner should keep a reserve stock of implements and tools, twice as many as they needed, so that production could be continuous. For the loss in the slave labor, time exceeded the cost of such item. There was a general presumption among employers that without supervision no work would ever get done. So supervision was paramount for both free worker and slave. To make supervision easier, workers were sometimes grouped into gangs or smaller teams. Columella recommended squads of 10 claiming it was easier to tell who was putting in effort and who was not in work group of this size. This show a detailed consideration of the management of labor. Pliny the Elder, the author of very famous natural history, condemned the use of slave gang as the worst method of organizing production, mainly because slaves who worked in gang were usually chained together. So, for today, that's all. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.